Imagine that you could build the Next.js app with a database without having to worry about writing SQL, scaling, or managing infrastructure. What would that look like? I hope that today's talk can give you a glimpse into the future of databases in serverless made easy. I'm Daniel from the Prisma team. But first, let me begin with how we got here. Over a year ago, we launched Prisma Client to general availability, a next-generation ORM for Node.js and TypeScript that helps you build faster and make fewer errors when working with databases. Since then, we've heard from thousands of developers about how Prisma is helping them build and evolve their data-intensive apps rapidly. Today, there are more than 40,000 Prisma developers, many of whom using it with Next.js. And this is no surprise. While Next.js makes app development fun and easy, Prisma makes databases fun and easy to use. Since releasing Prisma Client in June last year, we've worked tirelessly to make Prisma even better. We released Prisma Migrate to general availability, and Prisma Migrate helps you evolve your database schema at every step of the development workflow from prototyping to production. We also expanded our range of supported databases, and we now support Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, Azure SQL, SQL Server in general availability, and MongoDB and PlanetScale in preview. Finally, we also launched the Prisma Data Platform, which helps you start, collaborate, and scale your project. This is all part of our vision to liberate data and enable teams to take applications from prototype to billion-user scale without compromise on productivity, security, or compliance. But there was one issue that kept on coming up amongst Next.js and Prisma users. Using databases is tricky. Database connection management in serverless was the main problem. One of the promises of serverless is easy scaling with zero operational overhead of maintaining infrastructure. But the reality is that using databases in serverless is tricky. Database connections don't scale as easily as serverless functions do. Relational databases that can handle thousands of transactions per second can have a hard time dealing with 30 concurrent serverless functions connecting to it. And so, today's talk will be split into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll see how Prisma gives you the best DX when working with your database. In the second part, we'll see how Prisma is the perfect companion if you need to work with a database in a Next.js app. And finally, in the third part, you will learn more about our vision for the future of databases and serverless. And this includes the Prisma Data Platform, the Prisma Data Proxy, and finally, Prisma with serverless at the edge. And so I'll keep this talk hands-on with real code samples. So let's get right in. Prisma, the best developer experience for databases. There are 3 pillars that make Prisma so easy to use with databases. The first one is the Prisma schema, a declarative single source of truth where you define your data model. It can be written by hand or populated by introspecting an existing database. The second is type safety. And type safety is a way to ensure that all application code interacting with the database can only do so safely. For example, attempting to write to a non-existent database column will raise a type error that you can immediately see in VS Code. Zero cost means that you don't have to define TypeScript types like in most ORMs. With Prisma, these types are generated for you. Moreover, the types that Prisma generates give you rich auto-completion unlike any other ORM. The third and finally is code generation. And the idea here is that you should only need to write things once. Prisma saves you time by auto-generating 2 artifacts that you would otherwise have to write by hand. The first is the fully typed TypeScript client, that is known as Prisma Client. And the second are SQL migrations, which are generated for you based on changes in your Prisma schema. So let's see how all of these pillars work in action. Here I have a very simple Prisma schema that defines a single model. With Prisma, a model maps onto a database table. And this is a schema, a data model that will be used for a blog. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to evolve this schema and then see how we can use that in a Next.js app. And so to start off, we're going to extend the functionality and extend this data model to include commenting functionality so that every blog post can have multiple comments associated with that. So I have VS Code here with the Prisma VS Code extension, which gives you auto-completion and helps you when you're modeling your problem. So in our case, we want to define a comment model. We want it to have an ID that will be the primary key, and we also want it to auto-increment. We're going to define a comment field of type string. This will actually store the comments. And we also want to define the relation. And for the relation, we're first going to define the foreign key. So I will call this post ID of type int. And then I need to define the actual relation field that will tell Prisma how you can fetch those relations in Prisma client. And so for this, I'm going to name it post of type post. Now, if I use the format of Prisma, it'll automatically add the back relation. And there we have it. So I'm going to rename this to comments so that it makes sense in terms of the fact that it's plural. And there we have it. So we've just finished extending our Prisma schema by adding a new model, which will be the basis for a new database table. And now we're going to use Prisma migrate in order to generate a migration so that the database schema is aligned with our Prisma schema. And so this is really as simple as the npx prisma migrate dev command. This will look at the changes in our Prisma schema, compare them with the database schema, and generate the SQL based on this. And I'm going to call this migration add comments. And there we have it. Our migration has been generated for us, and our database is now in sync with the schema. We also had Prisma client generated for us so that we can already access and interact with the database in a type-safe manner, including this new comment table that has been created for us. So let's take a quick look at the migration. And here we have it, creates a table, and it adds a foreign key, which references the post table. Okay, as a next step, we're going to define a seed script. And a seed script is a way to populate your development database with some initial data that makes it easier to build and develop. So for this, I've already defined an initial file which imports Prisma client. And in this main function, I'm going to use Prisma client in order to write a post with some comments to the database. So let's take a look at how that works. Equals await Prisma dot, and you can already see how you get this rich auto completion. I already have the two models that I've created in the Prisma schema, and this is all coming from the generated code that was automatically generated after we ran the migrate dev command. So in our case, we want to create a post, and here we have all of the different CRUD operations that we can do. In our case, we want to use create because we're creating a single post. And here too, you get auto completion, and you can already see the squiggly lines. And this squiggly line is because we're missing the title and the excerpt, which we defined as required fields in the Prisma schema. And so let's start with the excerpt, and we'll define a title. And you can see that the squiggly lines are gone because we already defined the required fields. And now we want to also create related comments. And you can see how easy this is with Prisma. Using the auto completion, we have these comments. And here we want to create, and we're going to pass it an array and comment, wow. If I create another comment and I pass a number to it, what I expect to get is a type error. And this is because we've defined this as type string in the Prisma schema. And so here we're getting this type error to make sure that we're using the right type. And there we have it. The final step is to make sure that we've defined this seed script in the package JSON, which I've already done, and you can see that here. This is the command. And so let's go ahead and run this seed script. And for this, I'm going to use the Prisma db seed command. And there we have it. Our post and related comments have been created for us in the database. Let's take a look now using Prisma Studio, a modern GUI for your database, what that looks like in the database from the browser. To do this, I'm just going to use the Prisma Studio command, which will start a server. And there we have it, our post and the two related comments. We can also go ahead to the comments and add a new one. And here we can pick the post that we want to relate it to and save it. And there we have it. So that was Prisma in action. And let's just recap what we did. We extended our Prisma schema by adding the comment model. We then used Prisma Migrate to evolve the database and to update the database schema. We then used Prisma Client to define the seed script. We seeded the database with some initial data. And then finally, we used Prisma Studio in order to interact and view our data from the browser. In the next step, we're going to see how we can use Prisma with Next.js. Part 2, Next.js and Prisma. In this part, you're going to see all the ways that you can use Prisma to serve your data needs with Next.js. So this brings us to all the ways that you can fetch data with Next.js. And essentially, there are 3 ways. At build time, using static generation with get static props. This is suitable for data that doesn't change often, like a blog. You also have the option to fetch data at request time using server-side rendering with get server-side props. This is really useful for highly dynamic data that you want fresh for every request. And finally, using API routes with client-side fetching. And this is really useful if you want to extend your client-side functionality with some more data. And the good news is that you can use Prisma with all of these 3 approaches. So let's take a look at the code. Here we have the same schema that we've defined before and a Next.js app built and based on it. And here we have the index page that we can see here. And as you can see, I'm using get static props and I'm making a Prisma client call in order to fetch the posts ordered by ID in descending order, which will ensure that the most recent ones show up on the top. Also worth noting that here I'm using the same type that is generated by Prisma as the type for the props, and this ensures that we have end-to-end type safety. So for example, if I try to log one of the posts, I get the same auto completion as we get in the client side. So that was our index page, and we also have the page to show individual blog posts. And for this, we're going to show the server-side rendered version and the equivalent code. And here we're using get server-side props, which means that it will get rendered for every request. And here we're using the find unique because we want to get a single individual blog post. We're also taking the ID in the URL parameter and using that to narrow our query to an individual blog post. And you can also see how I'm also including the related comments ordered by their ID in ascending order, which means that we can, in a single query, Prisma client query, we can fetch both the post and the related comments. Finally, we also have these likes functionality that allows you to like a page, and this is using API routes. And for this, let's take a look at what the endpoint looks. And so here we have this handle function, and here we use the prisma.postUpdate method in order to increment the number of likes by 1. And so those were all the different ways that you can use Prisma to fetch your data. And I want to make a quick note about another optimization that you can do, and that is called incremental static generation. And the idea behind incremental static regeneration is that it's like a hybrid between server-side rendering and static generation. So the challenge is, if you add a new blog post to the database, you now have to wait for the whole build to finish for that to be reflected. And if you want those changes to be reflected more quickly, you can rely on incremental static regeneration. The idea here is that you define a revalidate configuration option in the get static props. And what happens when a request comes in, it serves whatever's in the cache, but in the background, it goes ahead and re-renders the page. And so that way, you don't have to trigger a new build for every time something in your database changes. So let's go back and take a look at what that looks like in practice. I'm going to use the index page because incremental static regeneration is used for pages that define get static props. And really, it's as simple as defining this revalidate and the number of seconds after which it'll regenerate when a request comes in. And so if I save that, that will ensure that the index page is always fresh with data from the database. So that was incremental static regeneration, another great optimization that Next.js offers. And so to sum this up, Prisma can be used for all of your data fetching needs in Next.js. In the next part, we're going to start looking back at some of the challenges of serverless and how we can solve them with the Prisma data platform. This brings us to the future of serverless in this last part of this talk, the Prisma data platform. In this part, we're going to look back at some of the challenges of working with databases in serverless and how the Prisma data platform can help you solve those. So for this, we have an Ask Me Anything page that allows me to answer questions with voice. The page has been built with Next.js, Prisma, MySQL, and we're going to see how the connection management problem arises. And so this is a very similar page in terms of the endpoints. You can ask questions, you can react to questions by liking them, and also I can go ahead and record answers using voice right from the browser. I love Next.js and Prisma. And I can upload that, and then it becomes visible to users. Okay, so let's take a look at the code for this. So for example, here I have the reactions endpoint that is called every time I click the like. And all it does is it increments the number of reactions. We also have the create question endpoint, which just creates a question in the database using Prisma. And also the get questions endpoint, which is used to render this page to show all of the questions on the initial load. And this is using server-side rendering, I should say. Okay, so when does this problem arise? Well, my database has a connection limit of 40 connections. That means that as many as 40 requests simultaneously can start causing the database to fail, which means that those requests will fail and the user requests will fail. In order to really emphasize this, I'm going to run a load test. And I have the load test defined here. And essentially what this load test does is it makes 3 HTTP API calls to get the questions, to submit a question, and also to increment the likes on a single question. And so to run this, I'm going to open up my terminal, and here I have it configured, and it's pointing to the same URL as the deployed app. And what I expect to see when I run this is that many of the requests will fail. And this will happen as soon as the database connection is exhausted. And I also should say that I'm running 40 virtual users. That means that in this load test, it'll be running this as if 80 users are making this request at the same time. And as we can see, only 90% of the get posts succeeded, 88% of the create question, and 87% to like a question. And so our goal is to reduce this to 0 because we're building production apps and we want them to run reliably. And so before we do that, let's take a quick look at this connection management problem with a nice animation. With serverless, each user request starts a new serverless function that opens a connection to the database. The problem is that during traffic spikes, you will quickly exhaust your database's connection limit. This leads to failed requests and lost data. That's why we've built the Prisma data proxy, which makes it a breeze to use databases in serverless with Prisma. It's a managed service that sits between your serverless functions and your database and handles database connection management for you. That way, you can scale your app without crushing your database and without user requests failing. And today, it's available in early access at cloud.prisma.io. Now that we have a solid understanding of the connection management problem with serverless, we're going to import our project into the Prisma data platform and then create the Prisma data proxy and see how it can solve the connection management problem, and hopefully we'll do another load test and see how all of the requests succeed. So let's go and open up the onboarding page. I'm going to name this project AMA Prisma. I will import the repository and tell it to use the main branch and define the schema path. And I'm going to use the existing database and set it to the Frankfurt region. That's great. The connection string for the data proxy has been created for us, which means we can go ahead to the Vercel configuration page and update the environment variables. So we'll copy that over, and I will open up my environment variables page for the project. And here you can see we have this database URL, and we want to look at the production one. And so we're going to go and change that to use the Prisma connection string and save that. And we will also need to update another one called the Prisma client engine type to tell it to use the data proxy. And I should note at this point that by using the Prisma data proxy, you're actually making the serverless function even smaller because the Prisma engine doesn't need to be packaged with it. Okay, so now that I've gone ahead and updated these environment variables, I can redeploy the app. And let's look at the main one, the production, and we'll redeploy it. And this will use our new connection string. Now that our build completed, let's check it out. So let's first open up the app. And as you can see, it's working. It's also showing all of the questions from the load test. And let's run a load test now to see if it still runs perfectly and if there are any failed requests. And as we can see, all of the requests succeeded. We just saw how the data proxy helped us solve this connection management problem, and I'm excited to share that you can try it out today. It's available in early access at cloud.prisma.io. And if you have any questions, be sure to go to ama-prisma.vercel.app and drop your question. I'd be happy to answer those. But wait, there's more. Database connection management in serverless is tricky, and as we saw, the Prisma data proxy solves this problem. But the Prisma data platform offers much more than just a data proxy. Let's take a look at some of the functionality it gives us. So here we have the Prisma data platform, and what you can see now is the data browser. And the data browser works very similarly to Prisma Studio, except that it's hosted and that it allows you to invite collaborators to view and also edit data in the database. So for example, here I can update the status of questions, I can look up the users in the database. In addition to all of this functionality, I also have the ability to write queries right from the Prisma Cloud platform, and this is using this query console. So if I open up the query console, I can issue, for example, a query to find many AMAs. And here in this query, I'm selecting just the ID and the question. And of course, I could also use order by here. And even here, you get the same auto completion that you're used to. So for example, we could order it by created at in descending order. We could also order it based on updated dates in any order that we like. And so this is a bit more of the Prisma data platform. And of course, we have a lot more coming in store for you, so stay tuned. Before I leave today, there's one more thing that I'm excited to share. And that is, I'm excited to announce that Prisma ORM is the first ORM to support relational databases in Vercel Edge middleware and Cloudflare workers. Here's the thing with serverless runtimes. As we saw, connection management with databases can be challenging. And while the Prisma data proxy solves that problem, there's another problem, namely cold starts. Initial requests to serverless functions take time to load, which leads to bad performance. Today, with the advent of Versal Edge functions, I'm now excited to share that it changes, because you no longer have to wait. And so, I've already implemented a middleware function in this AMA page to show the number of visitors. So for every request that is sent to this page, a middleware function updates the number of visitors. Let's take a quick look at the code for this. So here we have this middleware function, and as you can see, the structure is a bit different. This is because it's using Cloudflare workers under the hood, which is a completely different runtime that doesn't rely on Node.js. Here, we make sure that if it's the root path, we continue, otherwise we just continue with the request. And if it is the root path, we'll take a hash of the IP and then store that in the visitor table. We also have the visitors endpoint, which lists a count of the number of visitors from the last 5 seconds, the last 5 minutes. And so this allows us to provide this rich functionality with no compromises on load times. And in the near future, we expect to see both server-side rendering and static rendering to also support Versal Edge functions. And so I couldn't be more excited to try all of this out, and I invite you to try this out. Support for Versal Edge is now in early access, and you can try it out today. Before we wrap up and I leave you, I'd like to summarize what we did today. In the first part, we looked at how Prisma is the easiest way to work with databases. In the second part, we learned about all of the different rendering techniques and ways that you can use Prisma with Next.js, and how Prisma is your perfect companion if you're building database-backed Next.js app. And finally, in the last part, we looked at some of the connection management problems and the future of serverless and databases with Prisma. And so, before we leave, I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. And I'd also like to thank our community for having been with us on this journey and trying out Prisma and providing us feedback. This wouldn't have been possible without you. And so thank you very much.